For years, I fought alone, juggling bills, raising a child, and surviving on the crumbs of what my ex-husband left behind. He, on the other hand, lived a life of luxury, spending thousands on vacations with his new girlfriend, all while refusing to pay a single dime in child support. Meanwhile, I was forced to sell my car just to keep the lights on. Then, 3 years later, he lost it all: his business, his money, his image, and came crawling back begging for help. But this time, I was no longer the woman he thought he could walk all over. The woman who used to beg for a crumb of attention had become someone he couldn't even recognize. When I think back to those days, the weight of it all feels unbearable, like the lingering scent of stale air after a storm. My ex-husband, John, had made promises that sounded like sweet whispers in the beginning, promises about taking care of us, about providing for our child, about building a life together. But somewhere along the way, those promises turned into hollow words and eventually empty silence. The day he stopped paying child support was the moment I knew everything was about to change. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle, the foundation that I thought we had built together. He had been the breadwinner, after all, while I had stayed home, taking care of our daughter and tending to our home. Now suddenly I was left to scramble. There was no warning, no explanation. Just one day, his payment stopped. The first time it happened, I thought it was a mistake. Bills piled up, the credit card bills stacked higher than I could ever imagine, and I went from paying on time to being constantly late. I would call, leave messages, but they went unanswered. And then one evening, I saw him, John, walking out of his new girlfriend's apartment with a suitcase. The suitcase was for a vacation, I realized too late, as I watched him climb into a sleek black car, not the one he had driven when we were together, but a new one, a luxury one I would never have imagined he'd afford, certainly not without the support he owed for our child. He had moved on, seemingly without a care in the world, spending thousands of dollars on vacations and fancy dinners, while I was left counting pennies, trying to make ends meet. The reality was brutal. I had no choice but to adjust. I started working longer hours. I picked up odd jobs. I stopped buying things I loved, stopped thinking about anything that wasn't a necessity. But even that wasn't enough. A few months later, the car was gone. I had to sell it. That was my lifeline. I felt the sting of it every time I walked to the bus stop, knowing I had no car to rely on anymore. Every morning, I would drag myself out of bed, fighting exhaustion, and get ready for another day of scraping by. I hated it. I hated that he was off somewhere, on some beach with someone else, while I struggled to put food on the table. The worst part wasn't just the money. It was the idea that my ex-husband, the man who had once promised to support us, had completely forgotten about us. He was so caught up in his new life that he didn't even think about the impact it was having on me and our daughter. Each time I saw him post pictures of his lavish vacations with his new girlfriend, a new car, a new life, while I was stuck in the same old cycle, it made me wonder, how could someone who once cared for me turn so indifferent? How could he forget everything we had? Or was it that he simply didn't care anymore? Every month when those bills arrived, they felt like a slap in the face. I would watch the clock tick away, the minutes passing while I waited for his payment to come through. But it never did. There was no apology, no explanation, just silence. It was the kind of silence that echoed loud enough to break you down, until you were left wondering if anything that had happened between us had ever mattered at all. Days turned into weeks, and weeks bled into months. I tried to maintain the semblance of normalcy for our daughter, trying to shield her from the reality of the situation, even though I felt like I was drowning in it. There were days when I would wake up, exhausted from the sleepless nights spent worrying about money, and go to bed feeling like a failure. I couldn't afford to fall apart. I had to keep going, keep moving, keep making sure she was okay. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. Every time the phone rang, I held my breath, wondering if it would be one more creditor calling, one more bill I couldn't pay. I remember the day I had to sell the car. It wasn't just a vehicle to me. It had been my lifeline, my small piece of independence. I had taken so much pride in it when I first bought it, knowing I could drive wherever I needed, go to work, pick up groceries, take my daughter to school without relying on anyone else. But the payments were overdue, and the money I had hoped to scrape together wasn't enough to cover the bills. I thought about asking John for help, but I knew better. Asking him for help felt like begging, and I wasn't about to do that. So I called up a used car dealership and sold it, taking far less than it was worth. The few $1,000s I got didn't even make a dent in the bills, but it was all I had. I hated myself for doing it, for feeling like I had nothing left to give. The money I got from the sale helped keep the lights on for a couple of months, but it also left me feeling small, like I had lost a part of myself. It wasn't just the car, it was everything. The life I had imagined for myself, the stability I thought I'd have for my daughter, the trust I had once put in someone who had failed me. As time passed, I found myself growing more resentful of the life I was now living. I didn't just resent John for not paying child support, I resented the life I had been forced into. I resented the fact that every decision I made was dictated by a lack of resources, that I had to pick and choose between things I used to take for granted, whether I could afford a new pair of shoes or if I had enough for groceries. I was always cutting corners, always scrimping and saving, constantly thinking about the next bill that would arrive. I couldn't even buy a birthday present for my daughter without feeling guilty, knowing how tight the finances were. And then, of course, there were the moments of pride. I couldn't let anyone know how hard things had become. I couldn't admit to my friends or family how badly I was struggling. Every time I had to ask for help, I felt like I was losing my dignity. I didn't want anyone to know how far I'd fallen, so I pretended. I kept up appearances, making excuses when people invited us to things. I became an expert at hiding the truth behind a smile, hiding the stress and the pain behind closed doors. But no matter how hard I tried to keep my head above water, it felt like I was slowly sinking. I was doing everything I could to keep my daughter's life as normal as possible, but there were moments when I would find myself crying in the bathroom, feeling completely alone. And then, when I looked around, I realized that I was alone. Not just physically, but emotionally as well. John had moved on, and I was still here fighting for everything I could hold on to. As the months passed, I learned how to survive. I learned how to make do, how to stretch every dollar until it almost broke. I found comfort in the small victories, when I managed to pay a bill just before the due date, or when I could finally put a hot meal on the table without wondering if I'd have to skip a bill. It wasn't easy, but I started to find a sense of strength in the struggle. It was the kind of strength that comes from necessity, the kind of strength you only realize you have when you've been backed into a corner. Yet, despite all the sacrifices, despite all the hustle, I couldn't help but feel that nagging ache in my chest, the ache that came from knowing how unfair it all was. John had moved on with his new girlfriend, enjoying vacations in exotic places, while I was left to pick up the pieces of the life he had left behind. The sight of him on Instagram, smiling on some beach with a drink in hand while I was drowning in unpaid bills, was enough to make my blood boil. How could he be so careless? How could he not care? It wasn't until 3 years later, when I had completely rebuilt my life, that I realized the real turning point had come quietly, almost without me noticing. I had been so focused on surviving, on keeping everything together, that I hadn't taken a moment to truly reflect on how far I'd come. The bills were still a struggle, of course, but I had learned to manage them. My daughter was thriving, and while it wasn't the luxurious life I had imagined for her, we were getting by. There was a sense of stability, of peace, that had gradually replaced the constant anxiety I once lived with. But it was the small things that mattered the most. I could finally afford to take her to the park without counting pennies, to go on the occasional weekend trip, to pick up a toy for her birthday without a sinking feeling in my stomach. I had also started dating again, something I hadn't allowed myself to do in the beginning. I didn't want to bring anyone into my chaotic life, but over time, I realized I wasn't just doing it for me anymore. I was doing it to show my daughter that she deserved to see her mother happy too. That happiness didn't have to come at a cost. It was a subtle shift, but it was there, and it felt good. But then, just when I thought I had put it all behind me, John came back. I didn't expect him to. Honestly, I never even thought about him anymore. When I saw his name on the caller ID that day, I almost didn't answer. Part of me wanted to ignore him, just like he had ignored us for years. But there was something about the desperation in his voice that made me pick up. He sounded different, broken almost. He explained that things had gone south for him. His business had failed, his investments had crumbled, and his new life with his girlfriend had ended just as quickly as it had begun. It was hard to believe. After everything he had put me through, I didn't have sympathy. He asked for help. He was broke. He needed me to lend him money. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. After everything he had done to me, everything he had taken from us, now he was asking me for a handout? I could hardly contain my disgust. But then, his next words hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. He begged me for forgiveness. He said he had made mistakes, that he was sorry for abandoning me and our daughter, that he hadn't realized how much he had hurt us until it was too late. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for him. I almost felt like I was supposed to help him, because, after all, he was the father of my child. But the memories of the years of silence, the years of scraping by, and the emotional toll of being left alone without a second thought flooded back. I remembered the vacations, the new cars, the Instagram posts where he flaunted everything he had while I fought just to keep a roof over our heads. I remembered the months of stress, the days when I had to make impossible choices because of his refusal to support our daughter. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't the one who needed to forgive him. He was the one who had to come to terms with what he had done, and I no longer had the emotional energy to carry that burden. I told him I couldn't help him. There was no anger in my voice, just a quiet, unwavering certainty. I didn't have to explain myself to him anymore. I didn't have to justify why I couldn't help the man who had walked away from his responsibilities. I wasn't the same person I was 3 years ago, and I certainly wasn't the woman who had silently begged for his help when he had left me with nothing. This time, I was strong. I wasn't angry anymore, but I was resolute. I didn't need his apology, and I certainly didn't need his approval. What I had built was mine. The life I had given our daughter was mine. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all him. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. There was no rage, no desire for revenge. I had moved on. I had found my own way, and I no longer needed him to validate my success. The only thing I needed was the quiet, powerful realization that I had survived. I had thrived, and I wasn't about to let anyone, least of all him, try to undo that. It was done. He had lost everything, and now it was my turn to reclaim what I had built. There was no room for him in my life anymore. After hanging up the phone, the silence that followed felt almost deafening, but in the best way possible. For so long, I had lived in chaos, fighting, struggling, barely holding on. But now I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. There was no need for drama, no need to answer back or argue. The past had been rewritten, and I had written the ending. I wasn't about to waste my energy on someone who had long since abandoned me and our child. For a moment, I sat in the stillness, letting the weight of what I had just done settle in. It wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about revenge. It was simply about drawing a line in the sand and saying, enough. In that moment, I felt powerful. The power of not needing him. The power of standing on my own without relying on anyone's approval or help. I had done it all on my own, and no one could take that away from me. As time passed, I began to realize something that I had never fully understood before. The peace I had found wasn't just the absence of struggle, it was the absence of the toxic people and relationships that had once held me back. It was about shedding the weight of guilt, resentment, and anger that I had carried around for years, and it was about finally accepting that I didn't need validation from anyone. I didn't need to prove that I was enough. I already knew I was. The feeling of quiet empowerment settled deeper in me as the days went by. I focused on my daughter, on making sure she was happy, secure, and loved. I was no longer a woman defined by what I had lost. I was a woman defined by what I had gained, the strength to move forward, the ability to create a future on my terms. And as I watched my daughter grow, I realized that the best thing I could give her wasn't just a roof over her head or a stable income. It was the example of resilience, of strength, and of knowing when to walk away from people who don't appreciate you. One day, while walking through the park with my daughter, I saw a family having a picnic. The father was playing with his children, his arms wrapped around them in laughter, and it hit me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was happy for the families that had what I had once hoped for. But I was also proud of what I had built. I didn't need John, and I certainly didn't need his approval. I had created a life that was full, not with material wealth, but with love and security. That was enough. When John first left, I had wanted revenge. I had wanted him to feel the weight of his neglect, to understand the pain he had caused. But now, 3 years later, I realized that the best revenge wasn't a grand act. It wasn't about showing him what he had lost. It was about showing myself that I didn't need to stoop to his level. My success, my peace, my strength, those were the things that truly mattered, and they weren't dependent on him. The weight of the past no longer burdened me. Every time I saw his face in a memory or thought about the pain he had caused, I reminded myself that I had survived. I had come out on top. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a survivor, and I had won not by fighting back, but by walking away, by choosing me. In the quiet moments when everything else seemed to fall away, I could feel it. The subtle power that came with knowing I had everything I needed within me. It wasn't about wealth, it wasn't about status. It was about the quiet strength of knowing who I was and what I could do. I had made it through the hardest part, and now I was standing tall, unshaken. And as I looked at my daughter, I realized that no amount of money or lavish vacations could replace the value of the love we shared. I had given her the best gift I could offer, the gift of independence, strength, and the power of choice. The past was behind me, and the future was mine to shape. No one would ever take that away from me again. It wasn't long after my conversation with John that I started to settle into the new rhythm of my life. I had finally begun to find some sense of normalcy, the kind of quiet, peaceful existence that didn't depend on anyone else. I was no longer caught in the endless cycle of trying to prove my worth. My days were filled with little joys. My daughter's laughter, the satisfaction of paying bills on time, the rare moments of quiet after she went to bed when I could finally breathe. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. It was all I needed. But the past has a funny way of creeping back when you least expect it. One evening, about a month after I'd spoken to John, I was standing in the kitchen preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with him. John. His appearance shocked me. He looked different. His once polished appearance now seemed worn, and there was a desperation in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I simply stood there, staring at him. He was still the father of my child, but the man I had once known seemed like a stranger now, as though all the time that had passed had erased any familiarity we once had. The man who had walked away from me, from us, was now standing at my door looking like he was on the edge of collapse. He mumbled an apology, his words rushed and jumbled. I know I don't deserve it, but I've lost everything, my business, my house. I don't know what I was thinking. I've hit rock bottom. I don't know who else to turn to. I thought maybe you could help me. Just for a little while. Please. His voice cracked, the last word barely above a whisper. My first instinct was to slam the door in his face, to remind him of all the times I had begged for his help, all the times he had abandoned us in favor of his new life. But I didn't. I stood there, listening, allowing him to speak. And in that moment, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I didn't feel the need to get back at him. All I felt was indifference. He wasn't the man I had once loved, the man who had promised to take care of us, the man who had broken every promise, was gone. In his place stood someone who had lost everything and was desperately trying to regain some semblance of control. I stayed calm, though my mind raced. I had every right to tell him to leave, to remind him of the years he had left us to fend for ourselves. But instead, I simply said, "No, John, I can't help you." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the shock on his face, the disbelief that I wasn't rushing to his side as I had done so many times before. He took a step back, looking like he was trying to process what had just happened. I didn't feel sorry for him. I didn't feel any guilt. For the first time in years, I felt nothing but a quiet, unwavering certainty in my decision. "You don't deserve my help," I said softly but firmly. "Not after everything you've put us through. You made your choices, John. I had to make mine, and I choose not to help someone who's never taken responsibility for their actions." He didn't say anything after that. He stood there for a moment, the weight of my words sinking in, then turned and walked away. As I watched him leave, I felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, just a deep, quiet sense of finality. That moment, his return, his desperate plea, was the final test, the final measure of how far I had come. And I passed it. I had come full circle. I wasn't the woman who had spent years waiting for him to come back and apologize. I wasn't the woman who would bend over backward to please him anymore. I was the woman who had built her own life, on her own terms, without him. And I was stronger because of it. As I closed the door, a strange peace washed over me. This time, the past didn't have a hold on me. I had let go of the need to prove myself, and I had finally realized that my worth had never been tied to him or his actions. I didn't need to beg for recognition, and I didn't need to carry the weight of his mistakes. I had long ago let go of the idea that he would ever be the man I once thought he could be. He was gone, and now so was the last lingering thread of dependence I had on him. It was done. The next few days felt almost surreal, like the world had slowed down just enough for me to see it from a distance. John's visit had left no lasting marks on me, but it was impossible to ignore the ripple effect his sudden reappearance had created. The air was still, yet beneath the surface, there was this quiet, unspoken sense that things were changing. Not just for me, but for him. He had asked for help, pleaded for it, but that one word, no, had been enough to shift the balance. It wasn't long before the truth of his situation unfolded. Word started to get out, slowly at first, then all at once. His business had crumbled. The luxury lifestyle he had so confidently flaunted on social media, now nothing more than a house of cards, toppled by bad investments, poor choices, and a severe lack of foresight. The image he had so carefully curated for years, of a successful, affluent man, was gone in a blink, replaced by the reality of a man who had gambled everything and lost it all. I wasn't surprised, though. Deep down, I had known that the life he had been living wasn't sustainable. It was an illusion built on things that didn't matter, things that could disappear in an instant. And they did. The business that had once funded his extravagant vacations, the car, the house, all of it vanished. His new girlfriend? She had left him too. I didn't need to know the details to understand the crumbling of his life. It was the consequence of his choices catching up to him. The life of excess, the ignoring of responsibility, the selfishness, none of it had been sustainable. What struck me, however, was not the fact that he had lost everything, but the way he reacted to it. It was as if the entire world was crashing down on him, and the one person he thought he could turn to, me, had firmly shut him out. He didn't know how to handle this kind of reality. He had never had to face it before. In the past, he had always found someone to help him when things got rough, whether it was his parents, his friends, or me. But not this time. This time, I wasn't there to pick up the pieces. For a while, I felt indifferent to his situation. I didn't feel sorry for him, not one bit. In fact, the feeling of detachment grew stronger with each passing day. His downfall, in many ways, was a mirror to his past behavior: irresponsibility, avoidance, and a complete disregard for the people who had supported him. Now it was his turn to face the consequences. He had once looked at me like I was the one who was incapable of handling life. But the truth was, I was the one who had endured the hardship, the struggle, the pain, and I had come out the other side. He hadn't, and that was the difference. But as I continued to hear more about his losses, his home foreclosed on, his car repossessed, his credit destroyed, I couldn't help but feel a small flicker of something I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't even empathy. It was a quiet acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that we had both paid a price for the years we spent together. His price had been the loss of everything he valued. My price had been years of sacrifice, of going without, of enduring pain and loneliness. Yet here I was, standing on my own 2 feet, having built a new life for myself and my daughter. I didn't need to rub it in his face. I didn't need to say anything. I just had to live my life and let the contrast between where he was and where I had gotten to speak for itself. But life, as it tends to do, threw another curveball. The reality of his losses seemed to settle in, and soon enough I received a message from him. It was an email this time, long and full of the kind of desperate tone I had grown accustomed to hearing when he was trying to manipulate his way back into my life. But this time, the message wasn't just a plea for money, it was something deeper. He admitted for the first time that he had made a mistake, that he had failed not just as a businessman, but as a father and a partner. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he wrote. "I just need you to know that I'm sorry for everything." I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. Part of me wanted to respond, to remind him of everything he had put me through, to make him feel the weight of his actions. But something inside me had changed. I had long ago let go of the need for him to admit his faults, to apologize for the years of neglect. His words no longer had the power to hurt me. They were just words, empty, meaningless. I didn't reply, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I had finally realized something. His apology was for him, not for me. It was a desperate attempt to seek redemption, to clean his conscience after years of selfishness. But I didn't need his redemption. I had already redeemed myself. I closed the email, and for the first time, I felt completely free from the weight of his presence in my life. The man who had once made me feel small, invisible, unimportant, was now the one who had to face the consequences of his actions, and I was the one standing tall. It wasn't just the material losses that had taken their toll on John, it was the psychological toll too. He had lived his life on the edge, grasping at fleeting moments of grandeur, never understanding the true cost of his actions. But as he faced the collapse of his world, he was forced to come to terms with something far more difficult than money. The realization that the people he had relied on, the ones he had left behind, were no longer available to save him. And for the first time, I felt a sense of detachment, as if I were watching someone else's tragedy unfold. The silence between us after his last message felt like a breath of fresh air. I didn't feel the need to check my phone constantly or wonder what he was thinking. I didn't need to fill the silence with explanations or justifications. I had spent so many years caught in the whirlwind of his emotions, his demands, and his need for validation that I had lost sight of what it felt like to simply be. In the weeks that followed, I began to see the world in a new light. I had always been defined by my struggles, by the way I had to fight for everything, but I started to realize that these battles weren't the essence of who I was. They were chapters in my story, yes, but they didn't define my worth. The choices I had made, the sacrifices I had endured, the strength I had found in myself, those were the things that made me who I was. And it was in this newfound sense of self that I began to understand the true power of letting go. Letting go wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It wasn't about erasing the pain or pretending that the years of neglect and betrayal hadn't shaped me. It was about freeing myself from the constant grip of resentment. It was about no longer letting John's actions control my emotional state. It was about taking back control of my narrative. I realized that my healing wasn't tied to his apology or his acknowledgement. My peace came from within me. I no longer needed to wait for him to come around, to feel sorry for what he had done. His actions had already played out, and I had already moved on. He would always be a part of my past, but he didn't need to be a part of my present. It was a quiet, powerful realization. I didn't need him to make it right. I had already made it right for myself. I had already found my strength. I had already created a life that I was proud of, one that was built not on the ashes of his mistakes, but on the foundation of my own resilience. The days that followed were filled with a sense of calm I had never known. I focused more on my daughter, on the things that mattered. We spent our weekends hiking, laughing, exploring new parts of the city, and making memories that didn't revolve around struggle. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't constantly worried about the next bill or how I would pay for groceries. I had learned to manage, yes, but now I was able to appreciate the beauty of life without the constant pressure of survival. It was in those moments, watching my daughter run ahead of me in the park, her laughter filling the air, that I realized how far I had come. There was no bitterness in my heart, no lingering anger at John. There was only peace. I had let go of the need for anything from him. His approval, his help, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the love I had for my daughter, the life we were building together, and the quiet strength I had discovered within myself. I no longer had to carry the weight of his choices. His mistakes were his to bear. I had mine to live. And with that, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weeks turned into months, and the peace I had fought so hard to find continued to settle into every corner of my life. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from having everything figured out, from having all the answers or a perfect life. It was something deeper. It was a quiet confidence that came from knowing I had everything I needed within myself to thrive. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living, and that was a freedom I had never known. I watched my daughter grow, her smile brighter than it had ever been. She was no longer burdened by the tension that had once permeated our home. The arguments, the uncertainty, the anxiety. I had shielded her from it as best as I could, but now she could simply be a kid again. She could laugh without worry, play without fear, and dream without limits. And that was worth more than any material possession or fleeting luxury. In the quiet moments, when she was at school or tucked into bed, I would think about the life I had created. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what I had once envisioned when I dreamed of a perfect future. But it was real, it was mine, and it was enough. I no longer felt the need to chase after someone else's definition of success. I had learned that the greatest success I could achieve was the ability to stand on my own, to look at myself in the mirror and know that I was enough. Not because of anything anyone had given me, but because of everything I had built for myself. I had let go of the resentment. I had let go of the idea that I needed John to apologize, to make things right. I didn't need him to fix the past. What mattered was what I had done since he left. I had shown myself that I could create a life filled with love, security, and peace without depending on anyone else to provide it. I had stopped waiting for someone else's approval and started giving myself the validation I had always sought. As the seasons changed, so did I. I began to take on new projects, something that once felt impossible when I was drowning in the aftermath of my divorce. I started a small business, something that had always been a dream of mine, but had been sidelined by the pressures of motherhood and the weight of financial struggle. Slowly, but surely, it grew. It wasn't a get-rich-quick kind of business, but it was mine. It gave me a sense of purpose and a renewed sense of independence. I found joy in the small things: cooking dinner with my daughter, late-night talks, trips to the farmer's market. We weren't living in luxury, but we were living with intention. We were creating a life that was meaningful, not because of the things we had, but because of the love and strength we shared. And then one day I realized something I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at John, not at the past. I had forgiven him, not for him, but for me. Forgiveness wasn't about letting him off the hook. It wasn't about forgetting what he had done. It was about releasing the grip that anger and resentment had on me. I had freed myself, and in doing so, I had freed my daughter from the emotional baggage that I had once carried. There were still moments when the past would resurface, small reminders of the way things used to be, but they no longer had the power to hurt me. They no longer had the power to define me. I had moved on, and in that movement I had created a new version of myself, a version that was whole, complete, and free. The world didn't owe me anything. I didn't need to prove my worth to anyone. I had already done that, and the woman I had become, the woman who had fought through every hardship and come out stronger, was exactly who I was meant to be. As I stood there looking out over the horizon with my daughter by my side, I realized that everything I had gone through had led me to this moment. It wasn't a moment of triumph over my ex-husband. It wasn't a moment of proving anyone wrong. It was simply a moment of knowing that I had done the work, had put in the effort, and had created a life that was full of love, peace, and pride. And that, in itself, was the greatest victory. The past was behind me. The future was mine to shape, and I was ready.